Good morning. Is anyone else on the phone line? I'm testing our system to make sure you guys can hear us that are on the phone conference call. We'll get started here in a couple minutes. We're going to give people another few minutes to come in. But if you're on the conference call, stay on and we'll be with you in a minute.
Okay. Morning, everybody. Both here in the Sierra room and also, or the coastal room, and also online. I want to welcome you all to this second workshop on the future of e-waste management in California. So thank you for coming. Thank you for participating via phone, and we'll talk a little bit about phone logistics in a second. Well, maybe I'll do it right now. I want to just make sure the folks who are calling in, we're going to go around and at the end of my introduction and just ask everybody in the room to identify themselves, and we'll ask you on the phone as well. Otherwise, if you are listening in, we'll ask you to hit *6 so that you're muted and we don't hear background noise, sniffles, typing, dogs, anything like that. When you want to speak, you certainly can unmute, hit *6 and it'll unmute, and then we'll be able to listen to you. You also can send in questions via email to ewaste@calrecycle.ca.gov. Two other logistics things before I make a few more introductory remarks. One is that restrooms are out the back and left, and then another left down the corridor. Cafeteria is downstairs. If there is a fire drill, please follow us. We will go up these doors and down the stairs and across the street to Chavez Park, so follow us, so keep you safe. We take those seriously, whether it's a drill or the real thing. So please follow us out the door. Let me see if I can. There we go. So the purpose of this workshop is to get your input, stakeholder input, on possible approaches to some of the challenges that we are facing with e-waste management in California. And as this slide shows, and I think you're very well aware, we've had a very successful program under SB 20, but it only addresses certain video display devices. And historically, of course, that's mostly been cathode ray tubes. But traditional markets for CRTs have pretty much disappeared, and we have an increasing volume of non-CRT devices coming into the system to the point where I think last year we had about 9%. And that those devices are different, they are more complex, there are a lot of different aspects to their operation and management and the costs involved. They tend to have lower value but a higher cost to manage, so we need to be able to start thinking about that and how we're going to address that in the future. So we are pursuing at CalRecycle two parallel tracks, one of which we're going to talk about today. So first, I want you to make sure that everybody understands that we are continuing to pursue some enhancements to the existing covered electronic waste program. And these are enhancements that don't require statutory change. They may require regulatory change or administrative policy or procedural changes, but not statutory changes. These are things like, can we develop differential payments for some of the major existing covered electronic waste categories? We're taking a look at that. And to move ahead in this direction, we would need something that Jeff has hammered on for several years now. We would need more information in our net cost reports about the costs of managing those kinds of devices separately from CRTs, so we can make some analytical decisions about differential pay rates in the future. What are the variables? What are the processes? What are the key drivers that impact those costs? So we are looking at that. We need your help. Hopefully we got some information in the net cost reports that were just earlier this month. We continue to need that kind of information. The second thing that we're doing that does not require statutory change is looking at whether we can modify some of the specific documentation requirements currently in the program. That's a topic that's been discussed quite a bit in previous workshops. So we won't be talking about those two topics today, but I want you to know that we are continuing to work on, and we're happy to engage with you separately on those particular issues. So the second track is today's focus, which is changes that would require some change in statute in our underlying legislation. And what we've done is put forth two models, in quotes, for discussion today. One is to maintain the existing payment and fee program system and add additional groups of devices. The second model is to maintain the fee and payment system for existing covered electronic devices, but add a product stewardship management component or module for any additional devices that we want to include. And we are using printers, the category of printers as an example in those two models for discussion. We also are looking at, if we didn't maintain part or all of the existing payment and fee program, a full stewardship program be something feasible. So we'll have some discussion at the end about what would that take, what would you have to think about in terms of transition into some type of model like that. So our goal for today is to have a discussion with you concerning what collection and management might look like under these general models. Again, using printers as an example for illustrative purposes. I want to make sure it's clear that these are not CalRecycle policy proposals to adjust the existing program. They are models for discussion so that we kind of understand what it might take to move in any of these directions. Think about this further and as stakeholders in the legislature consider this. They are, I think, responsive to the input we've had at the last workshop on futures and to other workshops. They're intended as examples for discussion purposes to illustrate the issues that would need to be considered before we move forward. So I want to make sure it's clear that you understand their concepts. We're trying to identify the problem, make sure we're asking the right kinds of questions about these approaches, and that we would have the right information or tools in the future to move forward. So the agenda for today is going to be pretty simple. Let's see. That goes to... that's later. Yeah, we're good. Shirley and Jeff are going to make some remarks about enhancing the existing program. That's the first concept, to just include a group of devices within the existing program. We'll take a short break. We'll have another presentation, and there'll be discussion after that. We'll have another presentation then after the break about if we maintain the existing program as is, but add a stewardship component for printers as an example. We'll have a discussion on that. And then we'll have a discussion about issues and questions related to a fuller stewardship model before we wrap up. So I'm going to turn it over to Shirley, but before I do that, I would like to, since we have a relatively small group, we know there are a couple of stakeholders who are unable to attend either due to travel or illness, which is unfortunate, but we'll try to circle back to them. But if we could have the roving mics go around to those of you who are not CalRecycle staff, and we just would like you to briefly just state your name and your affiliation, and then we'll see who's on the phone so everybody knows who's here, because there's not that many. It won't take that long. So if you can raise your hand, non-CalRecycle. Claudia and Melissa, if you can.
Ken Taggart, ECS Refining.
Jack Rockwood, ECS Refining.
Would you like to start?
Sharon Simpson, Waste Management.
Kristen Sherrill, representing SEER.
Kelly Sequest, Sacramento County.
You just pass it back. Yeah.
Derek Thomas with Slow Dickens Jensen's on behalf of the Consumer Technology Association.
Tracy Bowie with Californians Against Waste.
Russ Caswell, E-Recycling of California.
James Ignacio, Tycoon Materials.
Thank you. And to my immediate side, I know. Oh, we got one more? Sorry.
Emily Pappas, Nemela Pappas and Associates for Hewlett-Packard.
Teresa, we'll have it, Teresa.
And Jamie
introduce
Miner
herself
also
too.
for Hewlett-Packard.
Melissa, could you hand it to Teresa, please?
Teresa.
Okay, and to my immediate sides are Shirley Wild-Wagner and Jeff Hunts, who I think all of you know, long-standing program manager, and Shirley's been involved with this program at the beginning and is helping us lead this project. On the phone, if you can unmute, hit *6 and unmute, can you let us know who you are, please?
Kurt Spivey, ECS Refining.
Thank you. Others?
Roy Dan, CalRecycle-Recycling.
Ed Siegel, IMS Recycling.
Anyone else? Okay, we'll check back in, and thank you to all of you for participating again. If you can hit *6 so we don't hear any background noise, but if you do want to say something during the open discussion, unmute and cough or something so I know you want to say something, and I'll make sure to get you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Shirley.
Yes, good morning. Welcome to the workshop. Good to see everyone that's here and hear you on the phone. Just a real quick update on what we've been doing so far since we last saw you in September. I've been learning tons, and that's the main word for the last few months. We've undertaken some research. Just as a review, we had the survey in July of last year where we received a lot of input. Thank you to so many people that submitted those surveys. And from that, we kind of built these next steps. So we had the workshop in September where we looked at some specific model ideas. They were just concepts, and we were trying to pull some information on what things we should develop further and what directions we should go. I have been able to interview folks from all around the country and in Canada, learning, as I said, about programs that they have done, some of the trends that are going on nationally, some of the strengths and weaknesses that they see in their various programs, some of the legislative activities that have been ongoing, and try to gain an understanding of what's happening both around the world and around in the United States. So that's bringing us to today's workshop, which Howard did a great job of explaining what we're going to try to do to get a little bit more input from you, determine the next steps as we move forward here. I know on the phone we're going to have some additional participation at different times from some of the people that I learned from, so hopefully as we get to them they'll be able to introduce us and talk a little bit about what their projects are. Really, this is the workshop documents is what Howard has already gone over. The documents, we do have some extra copies in the back of the room, and for those of you on the line, hopefully you can open the documents from the CalRecycle Public Notices website. If you go to the Public Notices and select today's workshop, and then you'll be able to open those documents right from there. So we have attachments 1, 2, and 3. One is what Howard's already described, the first scenario for the existing fee and payment program, adding printers. Attachment 2 discusses and describes concepts for the product stewardship model with printers. And then the third one is a list of questions and a bunch of stuff that we can talk about with you as we go forward here in looking at the product stewardship model. And that's all I have to say at this point. We'll turn it over to Jeff to talk about some things happening now.
Thanks, Shirley. Welcome, everybody. Great to see you. Before we get into the exploration of the management of something other than the existing CEW, I wanted to provide an update on current initiative. Howard touched on this a little bit. Not on the screen. Let's see. Okay, so not on the screen is a new development just breaking this week, which is the designations, proof of designations, the concept of designations within the covered electronic waste program. Those of you who have been paying attention know that the designation is issued by a local government to their service provider, approved collector, and that collector can then act on behalf of the local government and collect covered electronic waste under most circumstances with reduced documentation requirements. We have gone through a process, many workshops over the years, and then a process most recently to adopt rules under our emergency authority to change the designations to strengthen the bond between the local government and their designee. Those rules have now been transmitted to the Office of Administrative Law, and we expect them to be enacted early next week. We are behind the scenes working on guidance documents and updates to the associated forms, the proof of designation forms. So just if you're interested in that topic, pay attention. There will be some things that you will have to engage in over the next few months to maintain your participation in that facet of the program. Moving on to something that is agendized, formal rulemaking. We have for several months been working to formalize some rules that combine both two emergency packages adopted in late 2015 that applied to residual management, namely CRT, glass, but also other residuals derived from the processing of covered electronic waste, and administrative civil liabilities. Those two emergency rules have a lifetime of 2 years, and so they have to be finalized. we are taking the opportunity of the finalization of those rules to address it, a variety of other nagging issues within the existing covered electronic waste regulations, cleanups, clarifications, and then also something that Howard had mentioned, changing some documentation requirements. We know there's more to do on that, but we wanted to address some things that we know have been issues for participants in the program, such as the serial number requirement on the cancellation of non-CRT devices. We're proposing to remove the serial number, still have make and model, but we recognize that not every serial number is accessible. And we believe we can't have a requirement that can't be fulfilled. So we are pursuing that. Additionally, we know that that plasma panel glass is a problem material to handle. It has to be managed as a hazardous waste unless the generator can prove otherwise. And that creates economic burdens on our participants. We are proposing that the current requirement criteria to ship panel glass, plasma panel glass, before submitting a claim for non-CRT cancellation of that material type be modified. So stay tuned, if you're interested in those, we hope to file those rules with OAL sometime within the next month or so, and then they'll start a APA process, and there'll be opportunities to comment. We've held workshops on this, and there'll still be opportunities to comment. There, that's easier. All right. What else? Recycling payment rates. Everybody turned in their net cost report on time, hopefully. We had a pretty good compliance this year. Only a little bit of follow-up was necessary. As Howard noted, we have, as we have for many years, asked recyclers who handle non-CRT devices to non-CRT covered electronic waste devices to tell us more about the actual cost associated with managing that waste stream. We have the authority to establish different recycling payment rates, and those are tied in large part to the information we get from the annual net cost reports. We have used the statutory phrase major category to limit the number of recycling payment rates that we have established. We believe, as Howard noted, that the growth of non-CRT devices in the waste stream has potentially reached a tipping point where we must break out the payment rate that seemed to be sufficient for CRT devices and consider what paying for non-CRT devices would look like. And we all know that that is going to be much more complex, because once you get into that broad category, you have everything from plasma panels to LCD laptops to the rest of the that stream, all with its own unique management challenges and value or lack of value. So stay engaged with us, please, on that. We will be reaching out again. Thank you to those recyclers who did submit some information associated with the cost of managing that waste stream. We will be reaching out to all recyclers who handle non-CRT and try to get into the detail behind that. Okay, jumping into, I guess, the reason that we're here, which is, what would it look like to add a new device to California's official approach to managing electronic waste? Now, it in a way is a false question. What I mean by that is we already have a comprehensive e-waste management program in California, which is the de facto landfill ban on all electronic wastes. Really the question we're asking here is, how do we pay for that, or who pays for that? So it's one of, I know, my frustrations when we're talking across the country to our colleagues in other states. What is California's program? Well, California already has this comprehensive fundamental program, which is all electronic waste is presumed hazardous, regardless of generator source, cannot be landfilled directly. And then there's the covered electronic waste program, which is simply a financing mechanism to offset the cost of certain e-waste. But if we were to think about adding printers to this program, what would that look like? Well, necessarily it would require legislative change. That's because currently covered electronic devices are only video display devices, and while I think some printers do have somewhat of a video display on them, we're really talking about something that is not a video display device. So statutory change via legislation would be required. That would entail new definitions, both of what the scope of printers are, what the criteria of considering a printer a covered device, likely guidance or structure on how to establish the financing mechanism, the fees, or as well as the payment rates. And then the questions of our colleagues at DTSC, Department of Toxic Substances Control, who currently have the role of determining whether or not a given device is a covered electronic device within the broad framework of video display devices. They must test that device category, they must determine that it exhibits hazardous characteristics, and then add it to their regulations under current approach. And then once we have statutory change, then there will be regulatory change. And we enjoy an authority right now to adopt regulations as emergencies. I believe the wisdom of the legislature there was that this is such a dynamic industry. Things are changing, the technologies behind the products as well as the changes in the marketplace gives us the ability to make rule changes without having to go through the entire formal rulemaking process within limitations. And then once we have regulations, we'd have to implement. And I'm approaching today not as a presentation. This is not us telling you this is how we would do it. Instead, we're trying to outline those issue areas that would have to be considered, evaluated, and determined. This is, it's not a set of solutions looking for a problem. We've made up this problem right now, and no offense to HP or anything. The pretend problem right now is that printers need help in being diverted from the waste stream, theoretically. So what are the best solutions to use in achieving that goal? So as I go through this, I'm not lecturing. What I'm doing is I'm asking questions, even if it sounds like I'm making statements. I'm inviting challenges to our presumptions or especially to what we're not considering as we look at this effort. And I guess because I'm the manager of the program that operates under the existing model, I'm attempting to squeeze in printers. All right, so if we want to invite printers into this program. Well, first we have to scope that. What is printers? There's home printers, there's laser printers, there's inkjet printers, there's commercial printers, industrial-sized printers. What would the scope be? With the existing program, we have video display devices of a certain size that meet certain criteria. We would have to scope what printers are. So for the rest of this presentation, we're just going to say printers without having answered that question. What are the sources of that material? Well, under the existing program, of course, a covered device to be eligible on the program, meaning to have a fee assessed on it, and then for it to be eligible for subsidized management, has to come from a California source, but there is no limit to the generator sector. Because everybody pays, everybody gets to benefit from the program. I suppose questions could be raised, as since we're adding an entirely new category group, would that sort of approach still apply, or would we change the beneficiaries of the program based on need? Again, we're looking at what is the problem that we're trying to solve. Is it going to be households, businesses, government entities, nonprofits, everybody, or would that be different? One of the reasons we have the everybody pays, everybody plays situation now is the impossibility of determining at the outset, at the sale of a new device, upon which a fee is paid and the fund is created, of who is consuming that device, who is the consumer. If you asked, are you a home or a business, and you ask what's the difference? Well, home gets a fee on you, and business, well, I'm a business. No, everybody, under California's rules, everybody plays. Doesn't always have to be that way, maybe. And then currently we have a degree of manufacturer responsibility in the covered electronic waste program. People often forget about that. There is an annual reporting mechanism that addresses a wide variety of things. The presumption is if printers were added, that would continue. Moving on to what's even the rationale. If we're going to, if there is going to be an argument to the legislature for adding printers, you would have to have a rationale. And is it the weight? Is it the recyclability of that material? Is it the difficulty of handling it? Are they hazardous when disposed? And our friends at DTSC would have to look into that. Or is it the lack of value in the material, the intrinsic lack of value once it's discarded? We know that printers may contain regulated subcomponents or submaterials, including lamps and batteries. Toner cartridge management is a challenge. We know that the most valuable part of a printer is the half-spent ream of paper that is still in the printer when it's discarded. Fortunately, that's not regulated. We would want to look at how we can approach this problem and potential solutions to encourage waste reduction and recycling. Reuse. Printer reuse and printer cartridge reuse has been a hot topic. Well, maybe not recently, but it was for a while. The e-waste program, as it exists now, the covered electronic waste program, got a lot of heat from reuse enterprises at the outset. under the claim that we were encouraging the destruction of still usable, still viable material. The rejoinder was, well, no, actually the covered electronic waste program supported reuse by offering the pathway to responsible recycling if the material, if your enterprise focused on reuse and resale and I don't know that that was a convincing argument, but as we look to add any products to the existing model, we would certainly want to have continued use repair be not compromised. What data would we need? Well, who are the manufacturers? There are, I don't know, maybe 30 plus manufacturers of printers that are selling into the United States, dominated, you know, on one end or by a couple large companies, and there are some small companies. We would, you know, need to know who those are. We'd need to work with the Board of Equalization to identify that. Board of Equalization is a state agency that receives the fees that are paid. They reach out to the retailers. We need to engage with the manufacturers and inform them of their obligations to inform their retailer and distribution channel of any new program. CalRecycle would need sales data. Sales data is critical in setting fee level because we need to know how many units, assuming that the fees are set on a unit basis as opposed to some other criteria, to know how much revenue is necessary to support the recovery side of the program. As I mentioned, net cost reports are just wrapping up, and that'll be informing us about existing covered electronic devices. We'll need to bring any new device into those net cost reports, and how we structure net cost reports going into the future, I think is open to questions. We've got a lot of feedback, both from the industry as well as from the Department of Finance with regard to accounting and accounting mechanisms. You know, we see the world one way as a flow of material, whereas the money world tends to see things as a flow of money, and those don't always neatly overlap. So some consideration there. Let's see, let's move on from the fee to the payment rates. As anybody who is in the program knows, we raised the payment rates slightly last year for both collectors and recyclers. We have the authority, as I noted, to establish more than one recycling payment rate. The legislature appears to believe that a pound is a pound is a pound on the recovery side, and so there's not a current consideration given to collecting different types of covered electronic waste. But we do have that authority when it comes to the recycling side. And you know, what should that be tied to? Well, certainly the intent of the act and to cover the average net cost of managing a particular category of covered electronic waste. Is there anything else that needs to be taken into account? And I guess I want to step back and request that people think about and provide us some feedback on on this concept of major category. We recognize that within electronics are complex, and okay, you know, we've got glass beverage containers and there's 3 different colors. And that's complex. We've got, you know, a variety of different technologies, you know, a lot of innovation going on, miniaturization, difficulties in taking things apart. We can look at what DTSC has identified as covered devices. You know, how does that list, which requires, you know, some degree of interpretation, even as it exists now, connect with what a category is, what a major category is. And that's going to be critical in the coming years. So that's under the existing program. How do we do that under, how would we approach that under adding printers? Is it just, you know, a printer? Is it a printer fax machine? Is it a scanner printer fax machine? Is, you know, some other multi-function device? Okay, so that's, you know, scoping the problem. Then moving on to material management standards. We have the luxury, or under the existing program, of establishing requirements on the management of electronics that are handled within the scope of this program, the Covered Electronic Waste Program, because it's public funds. So we can say this material will be dismantled in state, and you must achieve, you know, some sort of material handling threshold, and even potentially limit the disposition of derived materials. And I think the most obvious example of that is the prohibition on the disposal of CRT glass that was in place within the Covered Electronic Waste Program up until late 2015, whereas our colleagues at DTSC had created a pathway for the disposal of CRT glass back in 2012. You know, the idea is here's of course to promote recycling when and where it is feasible. And by having the ability to have material handled in state, we know then that it'll be managed under the watchful eye of our colleagues at DTSC and conform with, you know, California's very strict material management expectations. Source documentation and processing documentation. All you recyclers are painfully aware of putting together payment claims. How will that change? You know, what way will it, you know, can it change? Howard alluded to that possibility. We're very much interested in knowing how can we make your lives easier while maintaining the integrity of the program. But what does cancellation look like of a printer? Where does the derived material residuals flow? What needs to be documented and then reported to the state if the state is going to be paying public funds for the management of this waste stream? And I think that covers quite a bit of stuff there to be thinking about. So what are the answers?
So we'd like to open it up now to both folks in the room and online. I'll just reiterate that this particular approach of kind of adding something to the existing program was something that was discussed at the workshop earlier last year and was really at least what I heard, many people were interested in this kind of model. So the idea here of using printers is really just an example to make it a little more tangible. Printers obviously are something that a lot of people talk about. So again, we're not proposing anything specific in terms of a legislative proposal, but this is really, as Jeff and Shirley have said, are we asking the right kinds of questions? What information will we need? What issues are we not addressing adequately? So want to open it up on this particular model, kind of what are your thoughts and concerns and questions? Or do we nail it? I'm sure Emily won't want to say anything, but any thoughts? Anybody online? And it's okay. I mean, what I'm anticipating, hope that's not mine. We want to make sure that if there is some discussion in the legislature or anywhere about changing the covered electronic waste system, that we have a foundation for responding and helping anybody who's involved in that we've thought through what would it take to make a change, what kinds of things, what kinds of data, what kinds of procedures need to be part of that discussion.
Quiet crowd. How about anybody in particular? Maybe we'll throw out some. Oh, we got some. Okay, good.
I understand that we picked printers as just an example, but...
Could you please identify?
Oh, Sharon Simpson with Waste Management. I understand that we picked printers because you got to pick something, but in the long term, changing the program, I think it's the same problem with the printers. How do you define what is really something that needs to be put in this program? Like, how are you going to define who the manufacturers, because they aren't defined by DTSC, and some people use, does it have a cord or does it have a circuit board, and how you identify all those manufacturers, even for printers alone, how do you define which ones get covered?
Yep. And do you have ideas or input specifically, or does anyone else on that? That is some of the questions. We know that many other states and other countries have included printers under different, they're not all the same definitions either, but some people have at least started to struggle with those questions. So that's why we're looking for anything here too.
This is where I think the product stewardship model probably would offer more flexibility maybe than putting it in the CEW system, because tracking would be, I'm assuming, a lot different with the Product Stewardship Council than the CEW model. And it could be kind of based on what the recycler actually receives that can be taken apart and broken up.
I think any approach is, going to require definition, and that is, what is included. Speaking only from my own experience in administrating California's current model, we're obsessed with only paying for what's eligible, and that's whether it's an eligible device or an eligible source. And so that's going to have to be defined. I imagine that any stewardship organization or any legislation that establishes that sort of mechanism would also require a degree of specificity. Whether or not a model different from the existing would be more flexible in terms of reacting to changes in real-world conditions, whether that's market value or economics or flow volumes, I can't speak to, and we'd be interested in hearing that, and I think Shirley will touch on that a bit. I think being able to identify who makes printers is not impossible, since printers are a part of stewardship programs in others, or programs in other states. So they pretty much know who the printer manufacturers are.
thought I'd seen a comment somewhere back over there. No. How about anyone on the phone? Would like to jump in right now? Remember to *6 and unmute and just start talking.
And let me just say, CalRecycle, I mean, we're emphasizing it. I'm going to just say it again. We're not going to be proposing printers be added to this unless, you know, there's a outpouring of need, and then it'll go through, you know, the legislative processes. You know, we have enough challenges right now, managing the system as it exists, the mix of materials that are in it. This is not an initiative. This is an exploration, trying to understand what it might take, so when that call comes telling us that things are changing, we'll be potentially ready. But, you know, unless industry, meaning both manufacturers as well as recyclers, speak up and say, for instance, yes, printers are a huge impact to my operation, and they cost me this much because I have to X, Y, and Z. You know, we're in the dark on this.
We'd rather hear you guys talk, but we'll keep talking to try and stimulate some discussion. Good, got a hand. I'll just say that this issue of, for example, of definition, that's going to be of paramount importance no matter what the category is, no matter which system it is. We have struggled with definitional issues both within the CEW program, our stewardship programs that we have, in particular for paint. Paint sounds simple. It's exceedingly complex in terms of what's covered and not covered. Same thing with the carpet program. There are so many different product types that definitions under any program become very critical, and be something that if there was a legislative initiative, you'd want to be able to go back and forth so that there's very clear understanding of, you know, what is covered, what is not, who is manufacturing that, who's involved. So that's a key issue. Clearly then costs and becoming another key issue in terms of if we were going to set different rates or have some kind of different fee payment system, we're going to need that kind of information in a manner that makes those decisions supportable.
I'm Jane Bay from SEER. I just have a couple comments, small comments. Our positions to add gradually, hopefully adding all, our positions to gradually adding all electronics into the payment system, if that's the approach we are taking. I agree with Sharon on the challenge to define what a printer is. And if we start with printers to be added, I strongly suggest we add copiers, which are, copiers are big challenges to us, the weight and the hazardous components involved and difficulty manually removing them, the cost. Sometimes it's more than the printers, the desktop printers, so copiers need to be added. It's going to be very difficult to define and recognize in the payment system, and we definitely don't want another waste stream to be added for us to tracking the manufacturer name, model number, and the serial number. So we are thinking if we putting all UWED electronics in and you track the payment rate by the net cost report we submit. So this way we are including all e-waste we can. Maybe that's a better way to track and see the sufficiency of the payment rates and the other material handling standards.
Okay, thanks. That is the kind of thing that's helpful that we want to hear from everyone. The real world experience, you know, copiers, heavy, hard to manage. That's exactly what the kinds of things that we would like to hear on any product category. One of the things, again, as far as Howard said, is stimulate some discussion. Jeff mentioned what cancellation might look like. Any of you are currently, well, not even just in this example, because we are looking at just the discussion purposes, but for any category, again, we want to know where we would go and how we would determine exactly what cancellation might look like. What are the markets? What are the residuals of concerns? Obviously, we would work with DTSC, but in your opinion, your experiences, what are those materials that have value, that require special handling? Any input on what a cancellation of a printer might look like from your experience? Russ has got a hand.
Russ Caswell, e-recycling of California. You just touched on like the value of material in say a printer or copier. One of the problems is in today's world there's almost no value, and so then if things get put into the program and you only look at the net cost every year or two, you know, we don't see any value anymore. You know, it used to be the scrap metal people would have contracts that went out for months. You knew that certain types of scrap metal were going to have a certain value over a period of time. Now the prices move maybe on a weekly basis. They're calling you, telling you, okay, it just went down $10 a ton. It just went down $10 more a ton. But we have to live with that for years. And there's no way to be able to figure out what it's going to be worth down the road. The numbers just aren't there anymore. The world economy's changed. China has their own scrap. They don't need our stuff all the time. So it's very hard for us to figure out how we're going to accept material from people. And then if the number that you're paying us doesn't work anymore, then what do? We wait until the net cost reports come through and maybe we get a rate change. But what do we do in the year before that? So.
This is Tracy Bowie with California CalRecycle. First off, I want to thank CalRecycle for your leadership on this, for being proactive and thinking, how do we move the ball forward with this program? This has been an overall very successful program. It is 9 years old, so it is about time that we think about adding new containers or new devices to the, on bottom of the limb, new devices to this program. For us, you know, we would be for everything with a plug, because you still have to manage it at the end of life. There's potentially toxic materials in that. But to the extent that that's not possible, then we would want to be similar to other states, other e-waste states such as Minnesota, where CPUs are included, circuit boards, and printers. So something that would be similar to the most comprehensive e-waste law in the U.S. In terms of what Russ was talking about regarding the net cost, what I might suggest that we tweak for the e-waste program is building flexibility into the program so that instead of just relying on the net cost report, which has a 2-year lag, basing it on the market scrap data. So there's I assume it's published pretty regularly, and taking a look at that and figuring out how much is needed to offset the cost for a recycler to dismantle it versus what they're currently getting on the scrap value market right now. So providing CalRecycle the flexibility to adjust that payment and to monitor that scrap market value.
Sharon again with waste management. To kind of work off what she just said, and kind of what I was trying to say at the beginning, is that it seems like we're in e-waste meetings all the time and you know what we're going to add to it and products, and I think adding the flexibility to where it is much more inclusive of the entire e-waste stream, I think would benefit us all as far as time management, but it would also, I don't know how we would track that per se, because I'm not going to count every single little tiny item that people bring me. They bring me boxes full of stuff with just cords, and then I have to go through it. Is it an appliance? Is it metal? Is it e-waste? Making it more inclusive, like something, it has a cord, or even it has a circuit board, something, or it's programmable, something that's a much more broader definition, I think would would help us all in this room, because most of us are taking those anyways, and then sorting it out later in the day. So that might help us a lot.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Sharon. Have you, hypothetically, provided that kind of some of the cost information on what, since you're taking some of those other devices, what is it costing to handle those? Are you willing to in some manner?
I mean, we have that information. And, you know, kind of with the HHW side of things on the Form 303, you guys have an additional survey that says, hey, give us some more information if you want to. That might be something you might do for the net cost report, saying, hey, give us some more information on the other waste streams. How much does it cost you to recycle? And more from the recycling side of view versus the collectors. I mean, I'd be willing to give that information to help move this along. I can't talk for my whole company, but I'm thinking it would be the same. But knowing exactly how much it costs to recycle it too, because we get that all the time. The recyclers come to us and say, hey, the metal markets went down, or they're so drastic that now we're going to add to your cost, or now we're going to pay, or now we're going to add, and it's constantly changing. And so from a recycler's point of view, how those are taken apart and what those costs, I think would be an added benefit. Not that I want to give us more work, but if it's going to help improve this project and move it forward, I think it would be helpful to have those actual numbers.
Yeah, this is Jack from ECS. I kind of want to echo what Russ and Teresa, and I think the other lady mentioned as well, that the volatility in the market with all the ups and downs that we have to manage when we're on a fixed pricing really makes it difficult to manage the business. Obviously, if things improve, it's a benefit, but we've been in a market where things have generally been trending down or going up and down. It really makes it difficult to manage the business on a day-to-day basis when we have a fixed cost for such a long period of time. So I certainly echo the concerns that our colleagues here mentioned as well.
Ken Taggart, ECS Refining. A couple different issues. In terms of getting data on the cost of recycling and whether printers are a problem and so forth, seems like you could kind of formally reach out to the recyclers in the program and ask them on a voluntary basis to provide the information on what the costs are and the recoveries are and so forth, and try to put something together relative to that. I think we recently got a DTSC inspection, and Matt McCarran was the inspector, and he even made the comment there's 8 recyclers doing 80% of the business in the CalRecycle program. And so I think you give us all the opportunity to respond, but if you got the top 8, you'd probably get a pretty good analysis of things. In terms of printers, I know we aren't focusing on that in general, but there's all different types of printers, and one thing you might do if you're truly looking at printers is you've got little label printers all the way up to big plotter printers, and you've got printers in other systems like point of sale terminals, ATM machines, and so forth. And so you might look at it and say printers with sheet paper or printers that have paper trays in them. But if you want to be consistent with your existing program of not doing industrial equipment, like we don't allow ATMs in the program now or gas pumps in the program now, but those have printers in them, right? And so those get excluded, and an easy way of doing that is to say it's got to have a paper tray, or it's got to have, the ability to take a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And then if you want to include plotters that have rolls of paper, you could include those. So I think, drilling down and getting an exact category is a pretty, doable thing. And then your question about cancellation. With printers, you might look at the removal or the destruction of the circuit board within the device. Or if you wanted to go to the fuser or light source that's within the system, the destruction or removal of that might be a way of doing that.
Thank you, Ken. I mean, that's exactly the type of input that we're looking for. I appreciate that every scrap of something related to electronics can be problematic and have potentially a cost associated with managing it. The challenges in scoping down what are those devices, not so much on the recovery side, because it's all, in theory, banned from disposal and has to be recovered. It's, who pays for it, and then where does that money come from? And of course, the money has to come from somewhere under the existing system. It's the fee, and we only know who to assess the fee on by defining what the product is. If you go to the existing program statutes, the video display device seems pretty straightforward until you start getting down into it, and then there's all the exemptions, which are commercial equipment, medical equipment, parts of automobiles, and so thank you for suggesting some. I think when people are thinking about printers in general, they are thinking about something that can handle this. But again, we're using this as an example of how to work through the complexities of adding anything to this model, or really to include in any model.
Is there anyone new on the phone or anyone on the phone that would like to comment?
Roy Dan from CalRecycle-Recycling.
Yes, hi Roy, go ahead.
Okay, I have a question about this this whole future of electronics waste management. Is the printer just serving as an example of where the future direction of the California electronic waste management is going to go? And we're going to gradually implement and put everything, all e-waste, into the system? Or this is just a first try?
Hi, Roy. It's an example at this point. Howard and Shirley and I sat around for many hours wondering how do we move this conversation forward, both as the program exists now and potentially as something else might come along. And we decided the best way to do it, instead of just talking in the theoretical, was to use a tangible object that we see, everybody's familiar with, and that many of our participants have experience with, as a mechanism. We're not proposing to add printers, as I just said earlier. That's not CalRecycle's role. But if and when printers or another type of electronic device is thrust upon the industry as well as the administrators, we want to be prepared for it. And then when you're talking or asking about, is this, setting the stage for everything to be part of this program, I would just say that, all the complexities that we're realizing apply to a single product would simply be, multidimensionally exacerbated to do that. So keep engaged, keep asking the questions, and then especially when we are using an example, you're a very experienced recycler. What are the challenges that you face? We can't be all things to everybody. The underlying statute that establishes the payment rate necessarily says we'll set that theoretically at the average net cost for the industry to handle things, which by definition means somebody's not going to get enough money. You'll have to find a way to make that up, or somebody's getting too much money to do who knows what with. That. So that I'm looking at Ken as I'm saying this, because not because I question what he does with his extra money, but what you brought up the issue of when the market changes and costs aren't covered. Well, what do? You adjust upstream with your suppliers as necessary and as provided for by the existing program and the existing regulations. So until we can cover everything, Roy, and or even entertain the thought of adding a product, you have certain costs offset by what is essentially a subsidy that covered electronic waste recovery and recycling rates, and then we need. That's why we're having this meeting, is to better understand what the future could and possibly look like, or is it even feasible under this model? And that's when I started talking about we needed to understand the future a couple of years ago. Frankly, I was thinking much more tangible things like can we change the payment documentation on cancellation, payment claim documentation and cancellation, because we just knew certain things were burdensome, and worrying down the road about the increase of non-CRT devices. We weren't even thinking about adding new devices. It's just like what comes next with this existing thing. And in doing so, wondering, is this the model that has worked really well, going to continue working?
Okay. The issue here is, and the situation that we as a recycler currently see right now is that if there was another waste stream that shows up, would the regulation catch up on time? I mean, the printer problem haven't been existing for just 1 or 2 years. It's been existing for a long time. So my thinking and my suggestion, and I asked that question, is why don't we take this opportunity and make a little bit more of a whole perspective on the waste management, the electronic waste management of the old e-waste angle, so we can give CalRecycle the status and the rights to be able to just go past the emergency regulations to deal with such a situation. As we can see, going toward the future, we have autonomous car coming, we have robotics coming, and we have Internet of Things coming. I mean, we're talking about intelligent toaster ovens here. So it all gonna go in becoming a waste stream. What are we gonna do about that? I mean, this is a great opportunity, and I'm appreciated that CalRecycle bring this up as a workshop, because this is time that we sit down and face this problem, because we ban all e-waste in California for landfill. So what is our rules and regulations allow us recyclers to do to help manage these e-waste and get properly compensated for providing that effort? So that's why it's a suggestion of mine. We might, using printers as an example, but maybe we should ask for a little bit more from the legislative side to give us more or to give CalRecycle or the stewardship organization more authority when the emergency regulation needs to be passed, or something like that.
Well, thank you, Roy, for sharing your thoughts on that. Yeah, I guess I would like to also note, why do we have SB 20, the Electronic Waste Recycling Act, in the first place? Well, it was recognized back in the early 2000s that there was, an issue with the management of e-waste. DTSC clarified the regulatory status of discarded electronics. We really have SB 20, though, because of the burden on local governments. I mean, that was the driver, that e-waste being generated by commercial sources, industrial sources, there was as Ken well knows, and perhaps others in the room, Russ, there was an existing e-waste industry in California before SB 20, and they were handling, the diverted material. All of a sudden, now local governments were saddled with handling the diverted material from their residential populations. In a way, that's a question that has to be answered or addressed as we even think about going forward. Whose costs are we attempting to relieve here or cover here? And correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who knows. In most other states, the other models in other states don't include commercial, industrial. It's focused at that residential generation level. We have what we have, the entire stream in this program, both because all e-waste is considered hazardous regardless of generator source, but also because we couldn't figure out a way to fund the program without having all the devices in the program, regardless of consumer sector. Anyway, yeah, Russ, I'm sorry.
Give me more time to think about it. I was just thinking about as we add things, or if we add things to the program, that there be some form of education to the California consumers. And we all talk about e-waste and miscellaneous waste and things, but outside of our industry, I think the average consumer doesn't really understand what e-waste is. There's a lot, when I talk to like neighbors and friends and people, my neighbors trying to bring me stuff to recycle for them, there's a lot of confusion because everything's become so electronic. Everybody thinks everything is e-waste. They think a microwave is e-waste. And now that they're going to have cameras in them, it's going to be another problem. But people just don't understand what's an appliance, what's e-waste and all. And if there was some way, maybe at the point of purchase or something for them to get educated, or I don't know how, but there's a lot of confusion. People don't really understand what it is we take and don't take.
I think there's a list on DTSC's website about what is electronic waste. Actually, I'm kidding. There's not. Yeah, no, that's a huge challenge. And as technological change just goes faster and faster, we will be dealing with this more and more. Emily.
Emily, oh, go ahead, Howard. I was just going to add that if this were to be looked at more than hypothetically, I think it would be important to look at what manufacturers currently do on a voluntary basis as far as taking back items that they manufacture, including printers. And so HP does have currently have a voluntary program in which we take back any of our products that are HP for free. And if they have a value, we pay the consumer that value. So I think it's important to look at what's out there already.
Karen again from Waste Management. So as waste management, a large portion of our stuff is coming from residents. It's coming from residential curbside and their trash and their recycling. And to his point, what I was going to say is I understand what the purpose of the SB 20 was, but as a person who gets primarily residential material, over half of my material that I receive is not CRTs or flat screens. They're the other stuff. And so, and that is a burden and that is a cost. And on top of his point, a very high percentage of that, even CRTs and really high percentage of flat screens and miscellaneous is coming out of the trash. It's stuff our employees pull out of the trash, and it's stuff that's coming over our material recovery line that people just think, well, it's recycling. So if I just put it in my recycle bin, eventually it will get to the recycler through us to the recycler. And whether that's education that they don't know that it's considered hazardous, or whether that's just pure laziness on someone who just says, well, I don't want to drive down there and I know it's going to get to the recycler anyways. I don't know what the answer to that is, but there is a financial burden for that other, which is way more than 50%. I'd have to look at my numbers, but I'd say about 60 or 70% is the miscellaneous stuff. And so, and I would say about 40 to 50% of that is coming literally out of the cans because people just thought it'd get to the recycler anyways, and it does after it gets smashed through a truck. So, which makes it even harder for the recyclers because they're getting cages of my stuff that's been smashed by a recycling or trash truck because we can't see it till after it gets to us. So, I mean, that there is an education piece to this that, regardless of how this system moves forward, that we really need to focus on more of an education. And when I tell even small businesses, okay, you need to go to DTSC to get an EPID number, they're like, who is DTSC? So there's a much bigger education piece to this too, I think, to make any of these systems work.
That's good information. I was just going to ask, specifically you, because you're the, I think, lone waste hauler in the room. How much of what you handle comes in through, coordinated collection, either, drop off at your facility versus, or, events. I know you have arrangements with the regional local governments versus load check. And I guess even if you can further break it down, CEW versus miscellaneous. That was a question. And then in terms of education, absolutely. And in fact, CalRecycle is undertaking a public education campaign, not specifically related to the covered electronic waste program. We're not using the monies that are potentially allocated via the statute for. It's working off of a, there's a term for it, it's slipping my mind out. Basically, payments for a violation, alternative stuff, yeah. We will be having public information campaigns, TV ads, talking about keeping electronic waste out of the trash. So, of course, that doesn't solve, how it's managed, but at least try to keep it out of the trash.
So specifically to your question, I don't track exactly how much miscellaneous e-waste comes out of my MRF versus what we accept directly. But we do that for flat screens, obviously, because of our tracking logs. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's around 380 or something flat screens we shipped this month. And 290 of them were from across my MRF line. And out of those 290, I only got paid for 100 of them because the other 190, or the other, 190 of them, there's no way in God's green earth they could pull off a serial number after it had went through a trash truck in the conveyor system so that we could pull them off. So, it's a pretty high percentage, and some of that could have been put through the system. I have documentation. I pulled physically. We know what we pulled off the line, but because of the tracking that they have to do for the serial number and all that stuff,
it's gone.
Which is why we're changing that rule.
Right.
Proposing.
So we're going to stop this portion of the workshop. We'll take a 5-minute break, let people stretch. Okay, we got one more. We'll take one more comment. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. But then we're going to stop and take a 5-minute break, and we'll launch into the discussion on a product stewardship component, which is going to have some of the same issues, but we'll talk about that.
Derek Thomas on behalf of the Consumer Technology Association. Just like to echo the remarks by HP that CalRecycle, we think, should consider the voluntary initiatives taken by manufacturers. And looking at the materials, you guys, there's many great ideas laid out for consideration in them. Synthesizing them, can you just kind of getting to the bare bones, how do you envision manufacturers' responsibilities changing from the current program, no matter what the product or approach may ultimately come up? Where are you guys going is, I guess, what I'm asking.
I think that's really the topic of the next presentation. So if we can hold on that for a second, for 5 minutes. Shirley's going to give a presentation on what some of the issues that would need to be considered if we were going to have a product stewardship component for X category of products. And I think that would start to answer some of that, or at least raise the questions, and then you can see if that's articulating that enough and asking the right questions. So.
But just, if I'm hearing your question correctly, we're not proposing anything. We are not going anywhere ourselves. We are preparing for the possibility that the world will change beyond the existing universe of covered electronic devices. So, other people might have a different perspective on this, but my view is that we are simply trying to understand how we would react to that changing world, but we are not advocating. We are not driving an initiative. We are calling this Future of Electronic Waste Management in California a project, but the project is to scope out what needs to be considered to be successful regardless of the models or the tools that are used to address whatever comes next. All right, 5 minutes.
Okay. No, I want you to finish, but you two can talk. Okay, we're going to go ahead and resume. I'll ask the conversations in the back of the room and to follow the lead of the conversations in the front of the room and cease and go back to your seats, please. Excuse me, folks. Andrew, Anna Maria, I won't say any. Ken, everybody. Anna Maria. Thank you. You guys can go out in the hallway if you want to continue conversations. We're going to go ahead and move on to the second segment of the workshop. I'm going to turn it over to Shirley. She'll talk about what would a stewardship model, product stewardship model look like if it was focusing on one particular group of products and maintaining the existing system for currently covered CEW. Many of the same issues.
Many of the same issues, and many of the same issues we can talk about here as well as in the general discussion of product stewardship ideas. Boy, I just noticed that this slide looks really weird because you can't see the words product stewardship. It looked great on my screen, and I wanted to call out when Jeff was talking about the existing program, because all the other words sounded the same: concept for electronic waste printer stand. So I really wanted to call out current system and product stewardship. Now you can't see it at all. Oh well. Best laid plans. This does read concepts for electronic waste product stewardship model. Okay, so get back to some of the things we were talking about a little bit before. If you saw the September workshop, those of you that were here in September, you saw an overview presentation. Cynthia Dunn of our staff, CalRecycle, did an overview of extended producer responsibility and product stewardship. So the concepts we're going to discuss today, both here in this printer scenario and in the next attachment 3 discussion, are really based on CalRecycle's definitions and the checklists and the essential components that are listed on CalRecycle's website. So if you have background information that you want, please check out the Extended Producer Responsibility website under CalRecycle's website. So to get back to a little bit of what Derek mentioned just real quickly before we get into the discussion, we are not envisioning any particular scenario, any particular role for any of the individual players, but we want to ask the right questions about what the roles would be. And that's what we want to make sure today, that we're starting to look at what those questions would be and what the roles could be played. What roles could be played by whom, I should say. So whereas these first two, the scenarios are specific to printers because we chose that based on the survey, based on the discussion at the workshop that people mentioned, and just because we needed to come down to reality. Attachment 3 is drilling back up there, floating back up. I should say we're trying to drill down. Attachment 3, when we discuss that, will be floating back up into the clouds a little bit more. But for the first discussion here on the printer scenario, I'd like to just sort of go through some of the questions and the categories that we're asking and we're looking at. And then as we go through them, ask you to think about comments and questions that you'd have and specific examples so we can get into the reality here. And then we'll open it up to discussion the way Jeff did in the existing program. So to move forward in trying to design a system to cover the collection and management of discarded printers, we need to address several elements. We, again, just like with the existing program, we would need definitions. You've all identified some of the problems with some of the definitions already as far as scope, but even simple things like what is a manufacturer, who is a manufacturer, we're meaning to be inclusive here, but exactly what they are, what's a product stewardship organization, and there would certainly be many other definitions that would be required in statute. For the scope, right now we've got a broad scope, sort of the questions that we're asking is a broad scope because it corresponds to SP20's current broad scope of CEWs, especially as far as the covered entities concerned. As Jeff said, everybody pays, so everybody plays. So, do we want to consider household, schools, businesses, government entities, nonprofits? Several of the other states and other countries cover a different subset of those covered entities. Europe and Canada generally cover everybody and everything. United States, different states cover various entities, some small businesses, some government, some nonprofits. So we would want to decide what would be covered as far as scope and entities, and historic and orphan products where the manufacturer is not identified. Again, we face that issue also with the existing SB20 covered electronic devices. Everything with historic and orphan printers, would be with printers, but also now with covered electronic waste is included in the payment, in the recovering and recycling payment system. Legislation would need to be strong for a product stewardship approach. We would want clear, enforceable legislation that would provide the foundation for developing the program. We've listed a few things under legislation in the background documents. If you have the background document attachment too, we're going through this the same way Jeff did. So I've listed a few things here that would have to be considered if there were to be a system developed for printers. sustainable funding mechanism, enforceable, again, enforceable goals, what are collection goals, what are performance goals, what are convenience goals, and we'll talk about all of those a little bit more in depth as we go through this. But what we've found in some of the other states, and that learning that I mentioned earlier and talking and interviewing folks, is that the more successful, sustainable programs have both a collection or performance goal as well as a convenience goal. And you can see this in both other states as well as in California, producer responsibility programs where there might be a collection goal based on sales sold into the state for use by different manufacturers, having a target goal, as well as saying perhaps a convenience goal of one collection opportunity per 10,000 residents, or a minimum of one in every city or one in every county. Different states, different countries have done that in various ways. But those are things that we would want to look at in legislation to be established as, again, clear and enforceable. Obviously, we'd need antitrust provisions, penalties for noncompliance, and very clearly what we've heard at other workshops and today is strong minimum management standards for processing, in this case, printers and printer residuals. We got into that a little bit with Ken. What would it look like? What could the management standards be? What would cancellation look like? In any producer responsibility product stewardship approach, we would identify primary roles and responsibilities. This gets again back to Derek's comment about what a manufacturer's role would be. All of those roles would have to be defined. Manufacturers, retailers, collectors, recyclers, CalRecycle, DTSC, what local governments, consumers, you and me, all the way down. So we've listed a few ideas here in the attachment for what some of the primary roles and responsibilities could be. There are numerous other roles that would have to be defined in a program. I could go through a lot of these, but I'm going through them kind of quickly so that we could just open it up to discussion. But I guess as questions or ideas come up from you, then I can refer back to specific things that might be listed here in the attachment. That might be better than me taking the time to just kind of read through everything. So I'm just trying to highlight a couple of the ideas from a high level. Goals would be established in any product stewardship approach. As I mentioned before, clear, measurable, and enforceable goals. We've seen this again in different product categories in California as well as across the country with both e-waste and other products. One of the concerns has been that a sustainable program offering year-round service has not always been accomplished in other states on e-waste, that some of the programs have met their targets before the end of the year, leaving recyclers, haulers, and local governments to somehow find an outlet for the material that's collected, but that is outside of has surpassed the target that's been established. So the goal has to be sufficient to create a program that's going to be sustainable throughout the program and throughout the year. That goes into, as I said before, collection and convenience goals. Financing, we've talked about different ways of financing a program. We have what we have in the fee and payment program. Different producer responsibility programs have been financed in a couple of different ways. I've listed, or we've talked about a few of them here. One of the keys is that no end-of-life fee be charged to a consumer. I think that's very clear in SB 20 and has been repeatedly confirmed in California that we don't want the end-of-life fees that can lead to other unintended consequences of illegal dumping, et cetera. So currently no other state has a visible fee for e-waste. Canada uses an eco fee, and other states and California have visible fees, consumer fees on paint, carpet, mattresses, and some of the other products. SB 20 obviously has a visible fee. In producer responsibility or product stewardship approaches, usually, at least for e-waste, it's been a cost internalization type of funding. Listed a couple of bullets here, making sure that the costs are the costs incurred by collectors, recyclers, and local governments are appropriately reimbursed. And we want to ensure transparency through stewardship plans that are, that are verifiable and available to the public. I think we talked about that a little bit more later. I've already spoken about enforcement a little bit. Roles need to be identified in legislation. Material management standards, again, we've talked about this a little bit already, and it's another topic that's key both here in a printer scenario as well as in general overall product stewardship approaches. It's been an area of concern for stakeholders in the past. There's been concern expressed that we don't have enough control in a stewardship approach may not exhibit the same kind of control that we have in our current fee and payment system for ensuring downstream appropriate disbursement and handling of the materials of concern. So that's a discussion that we would have to have here. How could a stewardship program ensure that standards are met the way we would like them to? We talk about certification. We talked a little bit about that in our workshop last time and in the survey. Should there be any requirements for participants and recyclers to be R2 or E-Steward certified or equivalent or some other? In Europe, they have another approach where some management standards, again, are required. That's a point for discussion and something else, an element that needs to be considered. Existing best management practices do exist in some of the other countries and states that we've looked at. Resources such as ERCC, the Electronics Recycling Coordination Clearinghouse, has some best management practices. Some of the other states do also. All of those are stewardship things that could be tapped into that are existing and or that we would need to explore further in developing a stewardship program for printers. Transparency, let's see, I think we're on to the next slide here. Transparency and accountability we spoke about a little bit. Stewardship organizations or a compliance organization of some type would need to coordinate with members, stakeholders to come up with plans and budgets to manage the material. Education and outreach we mentioned is how critical that is with misunderstanding and confusion among stakeholders and throwing everything into the recycling bin. That's a major portion of product stewardship approach. Typically, the manufacturer or the stewardship organization has a primary role in education and outreach. Certainly with printers, retailers that have printers, devices that they would be selling would probably have a role in consumer education, point of purchase information, how to discard printers at the end of their life. Product design research has indicated that really producer responsibility programs right now don't necessarily incentivize design for the environment. So ideas from you, are there ways that a product stewardship approach could better incentivize design for the environment, design for recycling, dismantling, ease of dismantling, fewer hazardous materials? The concept of modulated or disruptor fees, are any of you familiar with those at all? It's a concept that's been taking hold in Europe, especially France and Belgium, and this is where additional fee or fee relief is placed on a product or a line of products depending on the environmental factors or the recyclability. For instance, if there's a across-the-board fee on printers, then there might be a reduced fee if the printer is made in such a way that it's very easy to recycle and remove those hazardous components, take out the toner or the light, and they would actually get a reduction of those fees. Those are modulated or disruptor fees. A lot of different ways to look at that, and it's just coming out. But that might be something that could be discussed for product design. Like Jeff, I'm not going to go into the pros and cons because we can talk about pros and cons for stewardship versus fee versus printers specifically. I feel like I haven't done a very good job talking about the overall picture of what a product stewardship program is, and that's because I think we kind of did that last time. But there may be a desire to go, if you need a little bit more background on that, we could. But I'd also like to just open it up to you for input on all of these different topics that I've handled, that I've thrown out there, I should say.
And I'd like to open up, I want to reiterate what we've all said from the beginning. First of all, this isn't a CalRecycle legislative proposal or anything like that. At the workshop in the fall of 2016, we started to explore different ideas, and there was interest in the first model that we talked about, which is adding components to the existing system. So that was the first part of this morning. And there was some interest, not as much in my perception of that workshop, for those who attended, in a stewardship type of approach. But there wasn't a lot of understanding at that meeting, even though we tried to explain it, of what CalRecycle thinks ought to be included in a stewardship approach. So really what Shirley's outlined here is based on our experience in implementing the carpet, paint, and mattress programs, and it reflects the different components that we think need to be included if you're going to have a successful stewardship approach. And those aren't components that we see in all of the other EPR stewardship programs for e-waste around the country. So I want to make that distinction and hopefully clarify that. So whether there's a stewardship program that is for one particular category of products or for everything, those are common components that we think are needed to make that kind of program successful. We can try and answer questions, if you have some about that overall conceptual framework, or speak specifically more to how would this work if we had the existing CEW program and there was this separate industry-run program for one particular group of products. How would you mesh those or make those work? Because basically we would have is, under this model, is continue the existing CEW program, consumer fee comes to the state, we're paying it out for recycling payment, recycling collection payment, recovery payment, and then it would be a separate program run by an industry group, manufacturer group probably, under some legislative authority with specific goals, that would also be collecting a fee on those products and running a program designed to collect and manage those products properly.
Thanks, Howard. Definitely put it into better perspective. I think I've been retired too long.
Yeah. and then lastly, before we have Sharon and Teresa, either order, lastly, we have these questions on the last attachment about a full stewardship program. There are many of the same questions apply. How would you do transitions between programs? How would you make programs mesh? They're very difficult, let alone all the definitional issues that we had in the first round of what's in a product category and how do you specify that.
Okay, so I have a couple comments based on some of the questions she had proposed, but I think a product stewardship model is good in the fact that it does allow some more flexibility sometimes, and you have goals to specifically focus on specific areas of the state. For example, we have facilities in Modoc County, and the system now, as it is does not take into account the difference in transportation alone. For me to transport a load of e-waste from Modoc County, it's triple that of my facility in Sacramento. And so there's no way the current system can recover those costs. Whereas more of a product stewardship, if you had in the goals that it's per population based, they have to have so many opportunities per population based, I think you'd have more rural areas in the state of California actually being a part of this program that can actually compensate their costs. So I think that's a positive for the product stewardship. That's the biggest one. But also I think if we were to do a product stewardship, if that is the direction someone chose to move, I don't think it would be good to only include just this other stuff. I think if you're going to choose a different model, it should incorporate the CEWs and everything, so we're not managing almost pretty much the same waste stream under two different programs. Because, for instance, my recyclers take all of my stuff, so to separate those out for reporting purposes, or separate them out in transportation so that we can get those costs, so we're working under two different programs, I think is a logistical nightmare. So if you were to move to a different type of system, I think it should be done for all of the electronic products.
Tracy Bowie with CAW. So we were the sponsor of the carpet and paint and mattress bill, and then we supported the carpet bill. So we have some familiarity with the product stewardship programs, and I would have to say that there definitely needs to be very clear statutory language in terms of the rates and dates to make sure that the manufacturers are incentivized to perform the best they can. What I hear from other states with e-waste stewardship program is that the manufacturers try to keep the cost as low as possible. So one component that our e-waste program has is the net cost report that I would like to suggest incorporating into, if we go with a producer responsibility approaches, making sure that the recyclers are made whole, whether through a net cost report or some kind of mechanism, instead of relying on the manufacturers to try to drive down the cost as low as possible. In terms of the product design, I think reuse has been the weakest part in our e-waste program. So how do we encourage reuse? How do we design for recycling? For beverage containers, there's Association of Plastic Recyclers, and they come up with a design for recycling guidelines. So making sure that the recyclers, it's compatible with that recycling system. And so I might suggest something where, say, ISRI or R2 or eStewards come up with, this is, best practices for designing your electronic device or something like that. In terms of your question, should certification be required for recyclers, R2 and eStewards? I would encourage you to move away from that requirement, just because we're not sure what R2 and eStewards, what directions they're going to move forward. So it's a little harder to anticipate. But the valuable tool that our current e-waste program has is that recyclers only get paid if the material has been dismantled. That has prevented intact devices from being shipped overseas, where it might be dismantled improperly with very little safety concerns for the workers, and lack of controls for environmental pollution. So that's another thing that I would highlight, is making sure that the devices are canceled in the state. And then encouraging under the product stewardship program, encouraging the manufacturers to utilize existing network of household hazardous waste, MRF, our current recycling and collection infrastructure, instead of trying to, again, find the cheapest cost, but using what our existing infrastructure has to offer right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Lots of ideas there. You've thought it over. Other comments here or responses to those, Ken?
While product stewardship isn't necessarily my first choice, I like the California program. If you were to head towards a product stewardship program, one of the issues in other states where they have product stewardship programs is oftentimes the OEMs are not really involved. I mean, they join an association, and the association represents them and takes care of their pounds or their goals or needs, and those associations do a great job of driving the cost down and the recyclers aren't necessarily healthy, and longevity isn't very good, and as we've seen with the CRT glass, it piles up and so forth. So I think a better model would be to have the state determine the OEM's sales in the state or volumes, and put a figure on that and have the OEMs pay the state, and then the state dole the money out to the recyclers that are performing on behalf of all those OEMs. And this would take care of issues like the rural areas. It would take care of the issues of halfway through the year, OEM has met their goal and they leave those recyclers or collectors, now with all this material that, is not supported. So I think if you head that direction, we'll have a much better program with the stewardship program.
We'll move the mic around, Sharon, but let me just ask a couple of follow-up questions, because that's a different concept than what we've got on the table, which is great. Would you see that, I'm just trying to think that through in my mind, if the state was collecting a fee from manufacturers based on some sales proportion or whatever parameter was being used, would you think of that going out in the form of payments to recyclers to cover the collection and proper management of those materials, or would it be more in the form of grants to local governments to cover costs associated with HHW collection centers, or combos or variations on those?
I was thinking it would go to recyclers that were performing, so again, you'd have, recyclers that are approved in the system, and depending upon what products are part of the program or what categories, you might have different recyclers, or maybe if you had microwaves in the system, certain scrap metal guys might be in that program, but if you're talking printers, copiers, fax machines, your more traditional e-waste recyclers, would be approved to handle that.
So it would be, maybe I'm oversimplifying, so forgive me, kind of switching, in a sense, the current system where we have a consumer fee on sales to a kind of a manufacturer assessment, like we have on lubricating oil, or on, because manufacturers of lubricating oil pay a certain amount to the state, and then in that case, it doesn't go directly to recyclers, but it's used for recycling purposes. Is that?
Well, I don't fully understand the oil, but doesn't a lot of that money go to like education and grants? You go to lakes and harbors and stuff and give them money to, and so forth. I hadn't thought of the grant concept, but again, it seems like it could be incorporated in the existing program. It's just a different funding source rather than going to the retail level and getting it from the consumer, where you're going to the OEM and getting them to fund the program, and then you as CalRecycle would have control of the program, so you could worry about where the downstream materials went and made sure the people, were doing it right. I think, in California, we've got this great organization, the DTSC, that I think a lot of other states don't have as strong an organization, and so the annual inspections by the DTSC here, I think, keep the recyclers, doing the right job and, doing it with the least impact to the environment and so forth. So while E-Stewards is probably still a good thing and R2 certification is still a good thing, they may be less necessary just because we've got the DTSC here.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And so as I understand that, and I still might be oversimplifying, to me that sounds like expanding the current system, but changing the funding source from the consumer fee to the manufacturer.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just where you get the money, and as I say, I'm happy to get it from the consumer, and go with that. But if there's a desire somehow to go towards a stewardship program, I think it's most easily integrated in the system in that fashion.
Okay, thanks. Jeff.
Ken, don't go away. So and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're the only recycler in the room that operates outside of California currently and under some of the other models. Right? Yeah.
So we operate in Texas also, correct?
Okay. You're not involved in any Northwest?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
We do not operate processing facilities there. We have collection locations and bring the material to California for processing.
Within the context of those states' programs?
That's correct.
Okay. So I don't want to keep it positive. When you're comparing, your experience elsewhere, what falls short that would have to be remedied in California if California took an approach different than what we have? Here you're, for instance, while we might quibble about what the payment rates are, every pound that is accepted has a payment associated with it. Is that the case where you operate elsewhere? Are there limitations on how much you're required to pick up or how much is offered for sale to you?
Yes, I mean, in Oregon and Washington, for example, there's specific product categories that are part of the program.
Right.
And then it gets a bit more complicated because you have certain associations that while a product is acceptable, it's not acceptable to them. So you might have a computer OEM saying, I'm not going to pay for the recycling of televisions. And so now you have a collector that is providing you material, but you can't take the TVs, you can only take the computer monitors, for example. So again, back to my comment about the state the state getting the money from the manufacturers or the associations, you wouldn't have that sort of issue or complication. So I'm dealing with a goodwill in another state. I've got to run their product through two different programs because one program's not going to pay for the televisions, and so I've got to have two different programs to source all the material from that one location. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then what do you see as the major driver or drivers that drive down. You talk about California's program making the recyclers whole or the collection infrastructure whole, which it's intended to try to do that. What are the dynamics that prevent that from happening elsewhere? And if California was to, go to a different model, what would have to be addressed to make sure that, you met your volumes for the year, therefore, nothing's, no more materials coming in. Does that affect your financials? Is it just the number of recyclers that can meet the offering price from the stewardship organization? What's your biggest competitive disadvantage operating elsewhere versus here? I mean, and given that you're operating in California with additional regulatory burden, actually bringing material in from out of state.
Yeah, well, we've got a freight disadvantage, right? A local recycler there would have an advantage. The challenges are, and this is more for the associations, you've got to have coverage in all the rural areas and so forth. So as a recycler, if you're trying to provide that to an association, it's difficult, to cover an entire state and have all the collection points. But the one flaw, the one flaw in the California program is, when the program was initiated, this is talking with Andrew a little bit earlier, is in 2003, we banned all CRT devices from landfill. The cities and counties went crazy and said, we're going to go bankrupt. We need a funding source because household hazardous waste is killing us, and now you're going to impose the cost of CRT recycling on all the cities and counties. So you created the SB 20 program. And so the cities and counties and the landfills and the Goodwills and Salvation Armies in California should have been very happy for someone to just take the stuff away at no cost. That burden that they yelled and screamed about is gone. Here, those collectors, get a pretty good penny for that collection activity. In other states, a Goodwill or Salvation Army may only get a penny or two, if anything, for collecting it. They're just happy to be rid of it. So there is a lower cost, total cost of recycling in Oregon or Washington, but it's the collection aspect that's less expensive. So the beauty of the program there is the paperwork. We don't have near as much paperwork as we do here in California. So if you added other product categories to the program here, not having to have names and addresses would be a great advantage. It would probably reduce your staff, and it'd certainly reduce my staff.
And you'd have to place that Oregon stuff to go.
Yeah.
Well,
So two things. So the product stewardship, if you were to do that approach as well, kind of said something like what he just said actually, but the collector, there is a cost to those collectors to take those logs and to take that material and to package it. That is, the burden is on those jurisdictions or those collectors, if they're not a jurisdiction, to do that. And like with the paint program and the carpet program, one of the reasons why the carpet program isn't flourishing is because it doesn't at all help with those costs. And the paint, similar, there's not really a mechanism to support the actual labor involved with the collection. So if you were to go with a product stewardship approach, I think we would need to make sure that that was included and that you didn't totally discount the fact that there is a price with labor. The other thing is that e-waste is kind of a different beast from paint and other hazardous waste, because typically if I'm going to paint my house, I go to a physical store to buy that paint. If I'm going to replace my carpet, I usually go to a contractor or carpet physical store that can provide me great information on how to recycle that at end of life. Electronics, most people buy them from Amazon. They buy them online. You know, there's a very large portion of that gets purchased online. And so, and regardless of whether it was a product stewardship approach or this, you know, we come back to education. And I think we need to make sure that the education of those people buying it online is accounted for as well. Because when you go to a physical store, they hand you a pamphlet or they have a poster or they have something of that kind of sort. When you buy it online, it's just, let me see my checkout, let me see my, how much I'm paying for it, and that's it. So I think we need to make sure that that education piece is a requirement of those people selling those things online as well. Because that is where most people, or at least 50% of people, are buying those products from.
Those are really good comments, Sharon, and I won't speak to carpet because we have a lot of discussions going on about carpet right now. But I know in the paint program, for example, there were a lot of early contractual negotiations about coverage, what would be paid to collectors, whether it's local government, private, or whatever. And that was something that, you know, was not fully delineated in the statute. And so it did become an issue. So those are the kinds of things when you're talking about a stewardship program, or perhaps even just an expansion of the current system, getting the right language, whether it's a definitional issue or a compensation, cost compensation issue, those have to be really carefully thought out. Otherwise, we end up in a position where we're not able to take an enforcement action against an entity that's not covering everything. So.
Well, in the paint care, some of those things were, and some of them weren't. Like, you know, my labor for segregating things for reuse, like she was talking, you know, reuse is a part of the paint care product stewardship. You know, they promote reuse, and the way they do that is by compensating the collectors by really focusing on those products and seeing what can go back to the public. And if you have a reuse program, you are compensated for that material going back to the public, and it does pay for that cost. But putting it in a box and sending it off for fuels or recycling or incineration is not. So there are some parts of it that were covered, but when we're looking at this program, I think, you know, that's one of the mistakes that, you know, could be fixed if we were to move forward on a program, looking at the whole picture, not just the pieces, and that could be one of the ways to incentivize reuse too.
Okay, thank you, good points. Is there anyone on the phone? Oh, Derek, go ahead. And anyone on the phone too to jump in.
Derek Thomas with representing Consumer Technology Association. To address the previous gentleman's comments, so if I understood them, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were advocating basically shifting the cost of regulatory burdens onto manufacturers who would pay a fee to the state based on sales volume, who then recyclers would then seek reimbursement from to cover their recycling costs. if I understood right, then it would make more sense to address the underlying cost driver rather than shifting costs, wouldn't it?
Well, going back to what I initially said is I like the California program. I just as soon charge the consumer. But if we are going to go to a stewardship-based program, I'm just suggesting that rather than the OEMs dealing direct with the recyclers, which they aren't going to really do, they're going to go through their association and deal with the recyclers and pay the recyclers. I'm suggesting that they take that money and give it to the state and let the state manage the money. And so is that?
I would follow up by saying we agree, we like the current program. And again, it makes more sense to address the underlying cost driver as opposed to shifting the responsibility of who pays what from the consumer to the manufacturer.
Can you drill down a little bit more on how we would find those underlying cost factors a little bit, explaining that concept a little bit further?
Just going off his remarks about the paperwork and the reporting requirements and whatnot, sounds like those are driving up recyclers' costs. So to the extent you could, lower those, that would help their bottom end and really address the rising costs as opposed to shifting costs from consumers to manufacturers.
Okay, so you weren't specifically getting into underlying cost factors of the material itself, the degree of hazardous material, the degree of toxic materials, or the management of those. You were talking more about the administrative type costs of managing a program or managing the materials overall from that handling point of view, huh?
Correct.
Okay.
And I believe my suggestion to have the state manage the money would do that, because this issue of like rural areas, when you have an association, that association now has to have coverage in all the rural areas, which drives their cost up. So I think pushing the money to the state in California and having them utilize the existing recycler network would drive a less expensive proposition than the associations contracting directly with the recyclers.
Is there anyone on the phone who would like to comment on this? *6 to unmute.
This is Kurt Spivey from ECS Refining. Addressing Jeff Hunts's question on producer responsible legislation and that form versus SB 20. The producer responsible legislation puts an enormous amount of pressure on the recycling program, because it's the ultimate goal of the manufacturers to manage their costs down. And the essential purpose of SB 20 or any of this recycling is sustainability. And I think dealing in both of the programs, from producer responsible to SB 20 is more or less superior because of the way CalRecycle manages the program and allows sustainability by reviewing commodity ups and downs, although it could maybe be done more often because of the volatility in commodities and what's going on in China. But managing in a producer responsible state, the burden of the recycling and the pressure that's put on the recyclers and collectors each year that the programs that I've been involved in, program up here in Washington and actually throughout the United States with producer responsible states are like Ken mentioned, a legacy of piles of CRT glass everywhere, and you can see the results of it. It's not like we don't have the evidence of the pressure of that kind of stewardship program. So on first-hand experience, I guess I would, comparing the two programs, CalRecycle and what Jeff's done for the state of California and for the people has been superior to what we experience here.
Hi, this is Jason Linnell with NCER. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, Jason.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I just joined not too long ago, so I'm not just catching up on the conversation here. But yeah, so it sounds like there is a alternative that was suggested about having basically a manufacturer fee that goes directly to the state, and then the state distributes it, kind of like the current SB20, SB50 system. I believe that's what it was, which there is no other model. There's no other state that does it that way. I think there's been some other models where the manufacturers do pay a fee, or they pay based on their share. And well, I guess maybe in the sense of Oregon, which we actually manage the Oregon contractor program, the manufacturers do pay based on their share back to the state, but then the state turns it over to a contractor, which is my organization. Then contracts out with the collectors and recyclers to manage the system. I can't speak for the manufacturers, but the manufacturers might view a fee where it goes to the state as something that they would feel they wouldn't be able to control the costs of that system, or would be worried about the costs that would be charged by the state that they would have no control over, or no ability to push down, which that is, obviously going to be their incentive to push down the costs. To get as efficient as possible in their eyes, and still accomplish the requirements of the law. So it's an interesting idea, but I think it's different. It's not something that's being done out there, and I think some manufacturers might have concerns about it.
Thanks for those comments, and I'd say those are some of the same lessons that we have learned from our existing EPR programs in terms of cost structures and what is required of those stewardship organizations and how they meet those goals or don't meet those goals, and then what happens. So again, that's part of how those laws are structured and how you'd have to address those kinds of issues. Other comments? We're having a discussion that is, I think, a really good one in terms of the existing model, the existing program, some of the issues that we're going to need to think about within that, or a stewardship approach and some of the concerns. We're sort of covering what the questions that are on the third handout. And we don't need to make a full presentation on that handout. They were more, if we went to a full stewardship program for everything, how would we make a transition? What are some of the questions? And I just want to draw your attention to that handout and see if there's any questions on there that you think we need to discuss further. We've touched on a lot of them already in this discussion.
Some of the things that pop into my mind as things that we might get additional input on. What are you've talked about some of the suggestions, but are there specific elements, if we were going to build a full product stewardship model, what could help? What could help make the best one? Jason, now you kind of referred to this a little bit, but there might be some issues with that ongoing program. We talked about the way that the money flows, perhaps through the state versus through a stewardship organization. What would make that combination of efficient costs being driven down and plus recyclers being made whole and not being held holding the bag? Are there some specific things we could look at there? Another question, I think we've covered the idea of collection and convenience goals fairly well. But if you had additional input on that, we would also be real happy to take that. As far as, we talked about perhaps some of the states have additional cost credits or pay a fee, if some of those convenience goals aren't met, if there's not one collection opportunity per 10,000 residents, or can you get extra credit? Some states have, like, you get 1.5 pounds or 1.25 pounds of collection credit in a rural agency, a rural entity versus in an urban collection. Are there specific things that, if we were to look at a stewardship approach, what would be those key elements that would build the best model. Russ?
There's been talk about efficiency in recycling and design for recycling, and one way to drive the costs down would be if the manufacturers would share what's in their products. If you could scan the model number and link to a page that said, okay, the hazardous things in there are a bulb, a battery, and so on, or nothing hazardous in this product, or instead of the recyclers having to dismantle or look at things before they shred them and trying to figure out if in fact there is anything in there or what's in there. It's been great that things are easier to take apart these days. Plastics are marked better so you can tell what kind of plastics you're going to have and not using 40 different types of screws like they used to, things like that. But when you're standing there looking at a product, there's no indication of what's in there.
Just piggyback on that, there's a Massachusetts law, right to repair, which requires manufacturers to provide to consumers and recyclers what is in the product and just the diagnostic tools and blueprints so that it's easier to repair and reuse the material. So maybe something similar for the recycling process could be done.
Yeah, this is Jason Linnell again in NCER. Getting back to some of the questions that you were putting out there, Shirley, on this, I think those are all things that you do have to solve about are there actual collection targets, or is it based on the convenience goals, and what are the appropriate levels of convenience that are needed? Right now we do have some examples of places where you do have to have X number of collection sites per population, but you can't just look at it that way. You have to look at also how is the system organized. Is it if it's a manufacturer-based system, is every manufacturer then free to set up their own system and you have to look at the state as a whole, or do you encourage or require manufacturers to get into groups? Is there one default group that they're in and then they can opt out, like in Oregon and Washington and Rhode Island or in Vermont? Or is there some other approach or just how you're organizing the system? Because it's one thing to have the convenience goals, but then who does that convenience goal apply to? Is it the individual manufacturer? Is it a group of manufacturers? Is it all manufacturers collectively of that particular product that you're trying to cover? You have to solve some of those issues, and then some other decisions follow from that.
Very true. Good points there. Gee, you just want to make it a little bit more complicated, huh?
Yeah. Sorry.
Good points, though. Derek?
In response to the comment a moment ago about requiring manufacturers to disclose blueprints and whatnot, I just think that would raise many intellectual property concerns, and I don't think that's a very good idea.
On that issue of intellectual property concerns, it would be helpful to know that there are materials of concern contained. Anytime we get a device, we have to open it up first to determine if there's a battery in it, because we're prohibited in California from shredding something with a battery in it or a fluorescent bulb. So getting not necessarily a blueprint, but just an indication that there's something in there other than a circuit board would be helpful to us.
Derek, do you think that's something feasible to explore, or would that still pose concerns?
I think that's a valid concern and something to look into. I don't really have a position on it at the moment, but you guys are in the business of recycling, and I'm sure take due care to find out what's in the product and address it appropriately.
Okay, we're not really here to get an argument, but I disagree on the intellectual property thing. you talk about shifting the burden from the manufacturer this way and that. The manufacturer put the material in the product, sold it out into the world to the consumers. It's not a secret that there's a battery or a bulb, and we're not looking for blueprints, as Ken said. We just want to know what's in there. And I think any consumer has the right to know if you're selling them something hazardous.
Other comments, concerns? I'm about to. Oh, is there a hand, Claude? No. Okay. We can keep talking. I want to perhaps shift to the ending of this workshop. We can go till 1 o'clock, but we've talked about a lot of topics, and I think it's probably clear to all of you that CalRecycle doesn't have a one path forward here. We're not. You don't have a predetermination about what is needed. This has been more an exploration of ideas, knowing that we have a much more complex world of electronics. And how might we handle some of that and make sure we have a viable industry in the state and that we're able to provide for the proper management of these kinds of materials. We're going to take this input and mull it over amongst us and try to determine some next steps. I don't particularly, maybe Jeff and Shirley have some specifics. I don't have an explicit next step in mind at this point. We wanted to have this conversation and kind of hear what people had to say. I would like to get ideas from you. What do you think? What would you like us to do next, if there's specifics, in terms of continuing to explore this topic? Are there specific questions that it might be worth us diving into in more detail analytically? Should we just wait and see what happens with the legislature? What would you like to see us do in this kind of futures pathway? And if you don't have an answer today, but you want to think about it, that would be fine too. And it could be nothing, or do this, or do that.
I know Roy, Dan, you earlier, if you're still on the phone, sort of threw it back to us saying we should take this opportunity, which is a great suggestion, take this opportunity to look at everything again in big picture. And it sort of, I don't know that that's, I'd like to hear something too more concrete about specific next steps, but I appreciate this idea, especially with legislative initiatives and how they get started, and looking as much as we can, taking that opportunity to look at everything as much as we can. It's a little bit much for me to do, but.
Good, Sharon's going to bite.
You knew I would. I would like to see the e-waste as a whole, like what she just said and what the person on the phone said. I'd like to see the e-waste as a whole is looked at as a bigger picture, as well as minimizing some of the paperwork that gets done. And I think if you were to go with either approach, there's a way to address the stockpiling issue and all of those other things by possibly putting an inspection mechanism in there, even if you did do a product stewardship, just to make sure that people are only accepting California products. But the paperwork as it is right now is burdensome.
And when you say e-waste as a whole, how would you define that? So I define it as anything with a circuit board. Okay. So is it worth, yeah, we haven't done this, and I don't want to commit to doing this. Is it worth us just having a discussion about what's the range of types of products that might or might not be included in e-waste, and what are their attributes, and how would you go about defining that? Just so everybody has a kind of common understanding. Without picking one model or the other for managing them. And which ones are more important? Which ones are more costly?
I don't want to start a fight either, but I think DTSC would be very helpful in this. They put it on the generator, but then if we choose to say this is not because it's 90% plastic, they say, well, no, because it has this 10% and you have to do the whole shred test. Coming up with some more comprehensive definition of what makes an electronic waste hazardous, I think would be helpful in this discussion, and DTSC should be involved in this conversation since they're the ones going out and inspecting and determining whether we're breaking the law or not. So to cover ourselves, we say anything with, a circuit board. When I know that little plastic ball that comes into me that makes noise when my kid hits it is, if I were to put it through a shredder, probably wouldn't be hazardous waste, but can I take that chance? So having an actual definition would be great. And then everything in that definition would be covered in this electronic waste. But right now, microwaves is a good example. As an appliance, isn't an electronic waste. I've been told I can make my choice. I've been told in an email if it's more than 50 pounds, it's an industrial microwave, so therefore it's appliance, and everything else is an e-waste. I have 3 different definitions, all from DTSC and CalRecycle, and this was 13 years ago, but which one is it? And if you talk to all the recyclers in the room, they'd probably argue which is a microwave, is it an appliance, or is it an e-waste too? There's too many definitions out there. So what are we regulated by? And if we're regulating it as a hazardous waste or universal waste, let's cover it in the program and not piecemeal it out. But that's just my opinion.
Kelly Sequest, Sacramento County. Just from a local perspective, as far as categorizing the material, we have 3 umbrella categories. It's the covered electronic waste, the uncovered waste electronic devices, and then another category that we call REAM, and that is your recyclable electronic equipment. We love acronyms here. And so, but within those 3 categories, they're broken out. So the CEW, we have the CRTs and non-CRTs. Within the UED, we have UED General and UED Premium. And the general is typically the material that's a cost, and the premium is a revenue generating materials. And then the REAM is kind of like your household appliances, corded things, and things of that nature as well. So that's how we approach it. And each of those have different prices each month, whether it's a revenue or a cost to us, based on the market. So with our contract, the payment that either we receive or pay to our processor is based on a market-driven concept each month. So that's just some food.
And is that primarily through your HHW collection, or?
Yeah, it's through our HHW collection, as well as, so we accept it at our Kiefer landfill as well as our North Area Recovery Station.
Okay,
yeah. And then, of course, through our neighborhood cleanup program, it shows back up at one of those 2 facilities.
And I imagine that is, since you're a public entity, some of that cost information might be available.
Yes.
Might be very useful to see that the relative magnitudes of the differences between those categories. We can do some follow-up.
Just to closing comment, just to kind of recap some points made earlier. We think the status quo is working. The existing program has been successful, and there's been broad recognition of that from numerous stakeholders, both in the last public workshop and I think even today. Underlying cost drivers can and should be addressed, and other regulatory burdens in order with the goal of making recyclers and others whole. It was raised earlier that there were voluntary programs undertaken by manufacturers, and I think that CalRecycle should continue to work with manufacturers to expand on those successful efforts, we feel. And lastly, any requirements touching on intellectual property or anything like that should be steered clear from. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek.
In terms of next step, I think where CalRecycle can be very helpful is identifying what is the current sales information for the potential electronic devices that we're talking about, and then using the massive resources that CalRecycle has from the Form 303, the waste characterization study. What is the current disposal rate? How much of the material is actually being diverted and recycled right now?
Thanks, Teresa. And Jason, if you're still on the phone, you might have some input on market and sales data that, or at least sources for how to find some of that information to share?
Some sales information we get for other states that have market share requirements for the manufacturers under their laws. Not for the broad range that I was hearing here of the devices that are out there, but the typical electronics, the TVs, monitors, computers, printers, and some tablets, things like that. Some of the more typical covered electronic devices in other states. So we have that information, and we have some ways we can share some broad numbers of the total units or total weight sold in the country, and then you can break that down into estimates for California. So yeah, we have that information. I think that was a good suggestion. And also it reminded me that a few years ago, with Jeff Hunt's help, we were able to get some data on some of the reporting that goes on in the program for universal waste collectors, and we're able to develop a kind of an estimate of the non-covered or the non-CRT or non-CEW pounds that were being collected under the program, and it was very substantial. There's already a lot of the non-covered weight that's coming in, even compared to the CRTs that are coming through the program right now. So there's sources for data already there in California in some ways. It's not easy to pull it out, but there's ways to work with it and find out some other information about how much is actually coming back in currently, because it is very substantial.
Jason, if this is Jeff, if ERCC is interested in an update on that, we're happy to work with you and DTSC to try to get those numbers again.
Okay, great.
And we'll follow up with you on the idea of getting some of that sales data and see what it might cover. Sales data has always been hard for us to get, specific to California for a variety of products. Sometimes it's proprietary information, obviously. So anyhow, we can try and figure out approaches on that.
Right, yeah, and what we get national data. That's what the standard that all the other states use. The state-based data is very hard to get, and when you can get it, it's very expensive from the research firms. But national data has been used as a proxy, and you can correct for the state's population if you want to look at an estimate at the state level.
Yeah, thanks. Other comments? Anybody want to? I think we've got a pretty good idea of many of your concerns, maybe not all. We're happy to take a few more comments. We're also happy to wrap it up, let people get out to lunch or back to business. And as I said, we will be mulling this over amongst us and try to figure out what we might want to do next in this endeavor. So I want to thank you. I'm going to keep it open for another minute, but thank you all for joining here today and on the phone. It's a hard discussion. There are so many variables and complicating factors in all of this. So I think it's been really valuable to have this and get your perspectives on it. So thank you very much for all that. No hands being raised. I will hereby gavel the workshop to a close. You bet.
Thank you all.
Please have your passcode and conference leader's name